Hey everyone, I am Marcy Dean. I am a student here at Norwich University and I'm working on my master's in history and focusing actually on public history. So for anyone maybe unfamiliar with the term, public history is the art or the science of sharing history with non-academic historians. So it's just with the public. So today we're going to talk about getting uncomfortably comfortable. And what I mean by that is that we as historians and sharers of history should be okay with making people uncomfortable as long as they're in a comfortable spot. So in the book, What is History? E.H. Carr declares the study of history is a study of causes. And in thinking about history, Sarah Maza expands on this statement by saying, the statement makes sense to most people intuitively. The story of what happened must be inseparable from considerations of why it happened. So in other words, history is more than dates and names and places and people. It's a huge collection of whys, right? It's not enough to say Hitler started World War II. Historians owe it to the public to explain why Hitler believed what he believed, right? And museums really are one of the best places to do this and to tackle kind of tough issues like these. So we're going to take a look at why museums are a great place to do this. And then we're going to talk about three of the, in my opinion, top goals of interpretation that museums should keep in mind when they're tackling these tough subjects. So why do we need museums, right? Well, people learn about history in different ways. Some people go to schools, some go watch movies and TV shows and history channels, some read books, and other people go to museums. And according to the Alliance of American Museums, people trust museums more than they trust books and teachers. So getting the interpretation of history right is really a huge responsibility. According to UNESCO, there's about 95,000 museums in the world today. Back in 1975, this number was more around 22,000. Thanks to a dramatic rise in cultural tourism, it's so much easier to get around the world today. People really do go to places in hopes of learning something new. Out of those 95 some odd thousand museums, over a third of those are in the US. The market size of the museum industry in the US has reached about 12.2 billion US dollars. And that was in 2020, so during a COVID year, which was about just under 20% lower than in 2019, but it is expected to go up 25% this year. So recovery is starting to happen. Also in 2020, there were about 95,000 employees in the museum industry. So 2021, that's expected to jump about 17.5%. And when it comes to interpretation at museums, the father of thought is Freeman Tilden. Some of us have been blessed to be able to read his book as part of our curriculum here. But in his book, Interpreting Our Heritage, Tilden shares about 6 principles for sharing, for museums to follow in their displays and how they share information with their visitors. Some of these overlap a little bit, so we're just going to focus on the ones in bold today. So the second one, information is not interpretation. Number 4, museums should provoke thought. And number 5, always share the entire story. So first, let's talk about information versus interpretation, or data versus what it means. So this is Tilden's second principle we just saw. Information is not interpretation. Interpretation is based on information, but they are completely and totally different. Here's some facts. Rwanda, 100 days, 800,000 dead. 1994, Hutus and Tutsi, church, Via Nasta Bagasora. These are the facts surrounding this picture. The names, the numbers, the place, the players. I can throw all sorts of facts at you, but what have I actually told you? I can even show you a picture of skull and bones. But what story does this tell you? Is it eliciting sympathy, empathy, understanding? Who was the aggressor? In this case, who raised a machete and stuck it into the skull of a child inside of a church? Like many places of mass atrocities like this, the show of bones and skulls often tells the story of the number of the people that were killed here. I mean, there's a lot of bones here. However, with video games and movies these days, bones and skulls, even real ones, just don't seem to shock like they used to. This photo is from a museum out of Kigali, Rwanda, where about 5,000 people were killed over just a few days. The Museum of the Memorial has chosen to not just display the remains of the victims, like we saw in the last picture, but they have also hung the clothing of the victims from the rafters. The clothes have not been cleaned. They are still bloodstained. They've not been repaired over the years. They remain tattered and torn. Yet somehow the clothing here humanizes the victims. They are not just statistics to be shouted and counted. Numbers, dates, names. That's why people say they don't like history, is all that memorization. But if we humanize the story and the participants of history, our audience is more likely to remember that history. Putting the clothes next to the facts tells the story here. The facts fall short without the humanization of the victims. And I think this is best kind of explained by Sarah Lisher. She's an assistant professor of political science at Wake Forest, when she says there's a huge difference in reading about something and seeing it. So the second thing Tilden tells us to do is to provoke thought. I think this is the most important one of his challenges to interpreters. But chapter 5 of his book states the chief aim of interpretation is not instruction, not just informing, but it's provoking people to think and feel. So like we just discussed, it's not enough just to spew facts at our audience. Facts aren't going to be remembered unless you provoke a reaction or an emotion from your audience. And when I say emotion, I'm thinking, we're talking about things like anger, sadness, joy, relief, things like that. We have all seen the documentaries talking about the lunch counter sit-ins in the 60s in the southern US. We've seen the videos of the men and women who sat there and endured hours of relentless harassment. And when we watch these videos of the protesters sitting there, we're typically watching from the safety of a classroom, a movie theater, maybe even our own home. The volume's not really super loud, and even if it is, we can turn the sound down and even mute it or turn it off if we want. We do not feel the presence of a threatening entity just behind our shoulder, right? Just out of view. We see the white Southern men on the screen yelling until they're red in the face, dehumanizing the Black woman sitting calmly at the counter, who's struggling to muster what must be every ounce of courage in her being. We see it, but we are not there, and we are nowhere close to experiencing this. We can't imagine what the protesters felt. Fear, embarrassment, sadness, determination, resolve. These moments just can't be recreated. But some places, like the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, Georgia, comes really close. Here, they have invited visitors to sit down at a replica lunch counter. They can put on some headphones and place their hands on the counter while they listen to yelling coming through those headphones. And it's the same yells that the segregationist yelled at the lunch counter protesters, right? So they're hearing every abusive name you've ever heard. You're being threatened. You're not sitting in the safety of your home on a comfortable couch next to your spouse. It is really intense. Another exhibit there has you stand in a small enclosed space with videos of police dogs and their dogs barking at you. It is loud and it is fierce. And it's a harsh, scary, but realistic look at being Black in America, especially during the Civil Rights Movement. Visitors are provoked, to say the least. They feel the shame, the fear, the humiliation that these protesters endured. And just for a moment, they do feel that. I've not seen anyone leave that lunch counter with dry eyes, and been there multiple times. It is a very moving experience. So let's talk about exploring all sides of the story. So in chapter 6 of Interpreting Our Heritage, Tilden says that interpretation, or the sharing of history, must present the entire picture, not just parts of the picture. We're not just doing the right side or the left side, the victims or the victors. We've got to do all sides. And Peter Novick, in his book, That Noble Dream, states, historians must purge themselves of external loyalties. The historian's primary allegiance is to the object historical truth. So now I have to ask you, how can you find the truth if you only learn one side? For example, this may be what you expect to see if you visit colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. Men marching and taking up arms against the British, women strolling the streets, maybe doing a little shopping for some new candles or veggies at the market. And this is exactly what you saw in their reenactments and living history presentations that they did up until about 40 years ago. Catch is, Revolutionary Williamsburg was over 50% Black. But in these recreations of colonial Williamsburg, they skipped that. You saw no representation of the slave population. There were no people of color at all. So in the 1970s, Williamsburg updated its programming to include the slave narrative. Except it was a very clean, happy slave narrative, happy slaves everywhere. So in the last 20 years, they changed the interpretation again. So now a Black man walking down the street may be stopped by the runaway slave patrol. Reenactments may show families of slaves being told they're going to be split up and sold. The raw ugliness of slavery isn't exposed. It is a family venue, but the reenactments are more realistic than they were in the times past. It's definitely no longer a romanticized era, and it's how real people lived, and yet some people didn't really get a chance to live at all. It's the story of everyone that lived in Williamsburg, not just the pretty side. So how do historians at museums help their visitors become uncomfortably comfortable? I think this quote from the Auschwitz website says it all. There is no way to understand the world without in-depth confrontation between our idea of mankind and the remains of places like Auschwitz. And I think confrontation is the key word here. We must look at things and become uncomfortable with what has happened. And I want to stress something here for a second before I move on. All of the examples, including this one, are major issues in history. We're talking about genocide and slavery, but these concepts that I'm talking about apply to every aspect of history. If we're talking about the Enola Gay, right, the plane that dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, do you talk about its infamy or that it brought about the ending of World War II, right? Do you have one without the other? So how do we get uncomfortably comfortable? Well, we can do this by three things. when we're talking with our guests at the museum. So first thing is we want to spark thinking, right? Why did this happen? How does this make me feel? Can we stop this from happening again? And this is what the Rwanda Genocide Museum successfully does. We saw clothes that any of us could have been wearing. Something like this could happen anywhere. It's not, it's now personal. It's what can we do to make things different in the future? So we sparked thought. So now we want to create a safe place for that thought, right? This is a place for people to feel, not just learn. It's not about those numbers and names and places. Where can the visitor go to learn more? Are there more resources that they can research on their own? Can they get involved with an organization or within the community? How can they ask questions or provide feedback about how they feel or what they would like to see next? It's all about creating a place for visitors like the National Civil and Human Rights Museum, where they can confront that past head on and really become uncomfortable so that they can move forward. Lastly, there is a reason people believed what they believed and did what they did, right? We're here to explain perspectives and beliefs and put things into concept. We're not talking about making excuses. Colonial Williamsburg is not excusing or apologizing for slavery. I think that's something that often gets confused with this message. This isn't about apologizing. This is about admitting what happened. Slavery has to be included in that presentation of history so that the whole story can be told. Because without that, it's just not the whole truth and nothing but the truth. But again, this is not about making excuses or apologizing. This is just explaining the why. So I hope you guys learned something during your time here with me today. I appreciate you spending the time here. If you have any questions or comments, I think we're having a session right after this, or you can email me at my email address there on the screen. Thank you.